So we'll now begin our discussion of supergroup Opisthoconta. So I just want to remind you that we have supergroup Opisthoconta. It's a mouthful. And the defining feature of a supergroup Opisthoconta is a single posterior flagellum. And remember, that can be on any cell. So for example, we're members of supergroup Opisthoconta, but we only have the single posterior flagellum on sperm cells. But that's still the trait that, that's how we have the trait that puts us into supergroup Opisthoconta, in addition, of course, to ancestry. So within supergroup Opisthoconta, we have two kingdoms and their protist relatives. So we have kingdom Animalia, and we have the choanoflagellates that are the protists, that are our closest relatives. And then we also have kingdom Fungi. And the closest relatives that are protists of fungi are called nuclearia. So they're also in this supergroup with the kingdoms they're close relatives of. So that's an overview of supergroup Opisthoconta. We focus now on kingdom fungi. So fungi are a really diverse group. They include both unicellular and multicellular organisms. If they're unicellular, they're oftentimes referred to as yeasts. And so you may have heard of baking yeast, for example. That's a unicellular fungi. You may have heard of yeast infections. That's Candida, which is another unicellular fungi. Okay, so it's a generic term that refers to unicellular fungi. Multicellular fungi, you may be more familiar with examples like mushrooms. So one of the things that surprised many people is that fungi are close relatives of animals. So if I go back to this chart here, we see that the suggestion of linking fungi and animals into the same supergroup is that fungi are our closest relatives. Yes, that means that you are more closely related to a mushroom than you are to a tree. And for some reason, we find this disconcerting. I think because we have more respect for trees than a mushroom, or a mold, to be even more gross, right? So yes, that mold on your cheese or that mold on your bread is more closely related to you than the really beautiful tree or rose bush. And so we're going to explore some of the traits of fungi that make them more closely related to us and less closely related to plants. And so why do we assume that mushrooms and fungi are more closely related to plants? Why is that many people's intuition, even though it's not true? A lot of that has to do with the fact that fungi are also non-modal. So like plants, they're non-modal, whereas animals usually are modal. Modal means that they can move, okay? So that's one reason why maybe in our minds we sort of lump them together. Sometimes people also say, oh, well, I think of plants and fungi growing in the same areas. Like if you think about a forest, people think about mushrooms growing on the forest floor. So that might be one reason why we link them in our brains. But again, remember that the being linked together in a supergroup tells us about ancestry. And so fungi share a more close a more recent ancestor, are more closely related to us than they are to plants. Okay, so well, again, as I said, we're going to go through and explore some of the traits of fungi and see how they actually end up being more closely related to us. So the fungi are, again, as I mentioned, unicellular or multicellular. So this is different from both plants and animals. So remember, plants and animals are always multicellular. So that's a little bit of a unique thing to fungi. Another important feature of fungi is that most of them are decomposers. So they have a really important role, especially in land ecosystems or terrestrial ecosystems, of recycling nutrients and raw materials. So when they're eating, so I also want to add that this means they have to eat. So the technical term for that is heterotroph, Remember, plants are autotrophs, but they're heterotrophic just like us. It's just that they're doing a lot of decomposition. So when the fungi are growing on the forest floor, they're decomposing materials in the soil on the forest floor. Most people think that fungi actually came to land before plants did. And so this is significant because it's possible that plants could have never colonized land if fungi hadn't been there, because the fungi help provide essential nutrients that plants can't get without the help of fungi. So helping to make nutrients accessible in the soil. So these mineral nutrients that they need from the soil. As I mentioned, they're in the supergroup Opisthoconta, the earliest fungi were in aquatic habitats, so they start in water, just like plants start in water and just like animals start in water. And again, the closest protist relative is the Nuclearia. Again, sharing this supergroup reminds us that they are closely related to animals. So as I mentioned above, they're heterotrophic like animals. And then another interesting feature is that they store their extra food in the carbohydrate glycogen. So plants store their carbohydrate storage is in the form of starch, but animals and fungi store in the form of glycogen. Plants use fat as well. So remember, sorry, I said that wrong. Animals use fat as well. So fat is the primary source of energy storage for animals, but our short-term energy source is glycogen. And fungi store their energy as glycogen too. So this is a really significant similarity. Okay, can I say this enough times? Fungi are closely related to animals. They can't produce their own food. They use something called absorptive nutrition. So that means secreting enzymes and then absorbing the small organic molecules. So taking big molecules and using enzymes to break them into small molecules, and then being able to absorb those small molecules. So for you and me, the way that we do this is we eat the big molecules. So we put them in our mouth, we chew them up, we pass them into our stomach and through our small intestines. And throughout our digestive system, inside of our digestive system, we're using enzymes to turn that stuff like starch or fat or all the different things you eat into small molecules. And then those small molecules are absorbed into your cells. So we use our digestive system to carry out this process. Now, fungi do this a little bit differently. They use something called exoenzymes. So I'm going to highlight this here because this is the difference for fungi. Instead of having a digestive system that they put the food into, they actually send their enzymes out. So exo is for exit. The enzymes exit from the fungi. And so the fungi actually digest the food on the outside of their bodies, and then they absorb the small molecules. Okay, so the exoenzymes are outside of their body. They do their digestion in the environment around them and then absorb them through these transport processes across the cell membrane. So they're osmotrophic. They're able to use diffusion to move those molecules into their body. So again, we call this being absorptive. We call that being absorptive heterotrophs. And then again, reminder that as they access nutrients, they're going to store those extra nutrients in the form of glycogen. So one of the differences between plants and animals at first can seem like a similarity to plants, but we'll see why that's not actually the case. So when we look at cell walls, remember animals have no cell wall, but fungi and plants both do have cell walls, but there's a significant difference. Plants have a cell wall made out of cellulose as the primary component, so the carbohydrate cellulose, whereas fungi use the carbohydrate chitin. So it's very structurally different than cellulose. And in fact, if we look closely at chitin, we actually find chitin in the animal kingdom, not in the form of a cell wall, but in the form of other body structures. So, for example, insect exoskeletons oftentimes contain chitin. It's kind of the crunch of a bug, is the chitin in the exoskeleton. Now, in the same way that cell walls restrict plant cells, we see the same thing in fungi. So plants can't move because of their cell wall, neither can fungi. It also makes their tissues more sensitive, so they're easily damaged. They're not flexible in the way that animal cells are. So, if you're pushing on a leaf with your nail, you can actually damage the leaf. If you push on a mushroom with your nail, you can damage the mushroom. If you push on animal tissue with your nail, it doesn't break the skin, right? Unless, if you're doing a really, really, really hard, it could. But in general, you have that give in animal tissue, partially due to having the cells have more flexibility. So it restricts mobility in general. It restricts mobility of all of the cells unless they have flagella. So remember, the specialized cells are going to be sperm or structures like that have flagella. But other than that, there's really limited mobility of the cells. It also limits the ability to engulf large food particles. So the cell wall doesn't allow them to bring in very large things. So again, this is why fungi are going to have to do this absorptive heterotrophy using exoenzymes. All right, fungi have a totally different kind of body form than animals or plants. So animals and plants both have three-dimensional tissues. So they're multicellular and have complex three-dimensional tissues. Fungi, remember, can be unicellular, and as I said earlier, that means they're called yeast in that case. And even if they're multicellular, they have a very different body form. So they have what's called simple filamentous tissues. So rather than being complex and three-dimensional, they're just the same thing stacked on top of each other. And they're not like neatly stacked always, like they can be like this, but they're like long, skinny strings of stuff just kind of woven with each other in random ways. So again, kind of like, to use non-technical language, random woven strings of cells running throughout each other, just kind of piled up on each other to make a shape. Most of the time, the body of a fungi is invisible. So if you were to pick up a piece of soil from the forest floor, there's fungi living in that soil. You generally can't see them because their bodies are just these single-celled strings that are inconspicuous. They're just not visible to the naked eye. The only time they generally become visible to us is when they take these random piled up strings and they turn it into a bigger structure. And this is part of their reproductive process. So the large structures that we see for fungi are their reproductive structures. So on a forest floor, that might be a mushroom. On a moldy piece of bread, that might be their sporangia coming off the bread. By the time you're seeing these reproductive structures, though, the bread has been infiltrated all the way with fungi that you could not see. Okay, so bread has these fungi growing through it for a while, and then they reproduce, and you see the hairy stuff. Okay, so this is a diagram of these structures. So let me also define some terms here. So the body of a fungi is called a mycelium. So that's referring collectively to its whole body. And then the parts of the body, the strings, like I was using earlier, the term I was using earlier, are the hyphae. So those are the strings that make up the body. So this whole thing here is a mycelium, and then these individual parts here are hyphae. Okay. And so that can be growing through the soil or a piece of bread, and you can't see it. It's not visible to the naked eye because they're so small. They're single-celled thickness, so you couldn't see them without a microscope. Now, if two mycelia, so two fungi, mate with each other, and they mate when they meet in the middle, so this one grows towards this one, and this one grows towards this one, they will fuse, and then that will trigger it to form a reproductive structure. And that, in this case, is a mushroom, though more generally we call it a fruiting body. So a fruiting body is its reproductive structure that forms after mating. And in some cases it's a mushroom, though it can have other names depending on the type of fungus. So fungi grow very quickly. So if they're on like a tasty piece of bread that has lots of nutrients in it, they can grow very fast, especially if they're at warm temperatures. And maybe you've experienced that with bread on your counter. They grow at the edges. So if I go back to this figure here, it's these areas here that are growing, the tips. So if there's food out here, so if there's lots of yummy stuff out here, it will grow from these tips towards that yummy stuff and keep eating it as it moves. They grow by absorbing more water. So basically they use osmosis and they fill up those tips with water, and that lets them elongate. So the significance of this is water is essential for growth. So you can think about this in your everyday life maybe. So if you have a moist piece of bread, then you have the potential for mold growth, and mold is a type of fungus. If you have a dry piece of bread, and in Colorado this happens a lot, right? If you leave a piece of bread out, it will just totally desiccate. If you have a dried out piece of bread, then you won't get any mold growth. You can just leave that dried out piece of bread sitting out forever and it won't grow mold, because water is absolutely essential for fungal growth. And so this is just an image showing us this growing tip. So this is a tip of a hypha. This is a micrograph of it. This is the figure. And so there's an osmotic process where water has to flow in, and the water flows in and swells this tip, and that allows it to grow out this way. At the same time, it's only going to happen if there's nutrients, right? So here's the exoenzymes being made. So if there's food out here, it's sending out exoenzymes. The exoenzymes are breaking down. So say it's bread, they're breaking down the starch into small molecules. And then those small molecules are being taken in by the fungal hypha as well. And so that's what's happening as a fungus is growing. So in general, their body forms are very irregular for this reason. They're just swelling with water wherever water is, and food is coming in wherever it can come in. So they don't ever like look the same. Like one mycelium doesn't have the exact same shape as another mycelium. These are two pictures where we can kind of see fungus growing more than we can, for example, in soil. So, and maybe you've seen this, most people have seen this at some point. So this is a fungus growing in liquid. So you're most likely to have seen this growing in juice at home. So if you've ever left a thing of juice in your fridge for a really long time, you may have seen little balls of mold growing in there. If you've never noticed it before, keep your eyes open, because sometimes these will be growing in there and the juice won't necessarily taste bad, and it's not necessarily going to hurt you. But unless you would be horrified if you got that in your mouth, but it's not going to kill you or anything. But you'll see these little balls of mold. This is mold growing on a two-dimensional surface. In this case, it's intentional in a laboratory. But a two-dimensional surface would also be like a piece of bread. And so you see these circles of mold with this more regular shape because they're growing on a two-dimensional surface. But again, remember that its growth process is random. So just because the mold looks like this doesn't mean the mold next to it looks exactly the same because it's an irregular process.